joining us today, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the Cloud Advisory, How to Get the Most Value. Today we are joined by Chris Huntley, Associate Partner Solutions at Taos, Donald Lutz, Cloud Architect at Taos, and Shadoe DiStefano, Consultant at Cloud Architect at Taos. Today they'll be discussing different potential options for approaching cloud value. Christopher?
Hey, thank you. So here we are, cloud cost optimization. Now it's more FinOps. We're talking about really using the current structure to get you to optimization. Initially, we talked about cost, but over time, we've realized that cost isn't everything. So here from Flipshare, we have Daily Cloud Report. It tells us about 30% of waste, and this is self-reported. So organizations look at this, and they estimate that about 30% of their spend is just wasted on inefficiencies. And 61% are looking at optimizing use of the cloud, which I'm not really sure is always cost savings. We're going to talk a little bit more today about optimization towards the 5 pillars approach differently than just looking at savings. We're trying to get everybody to get what they want out of it and get the most value versus the least spend. So I think this is probably true, and organizations looking at it think, 30% seems like a pretty reasonable amount, and that's where you can start to get all these optimizations. So looking here, we have 7 possible drivers for change. There's unforeseen costs or fluctuating consumption, and this has to do with how easy it is to use the cloud. High efforts to respond to cost audits, it's too much time digesting. And I think it really comes down to kind of 3 basic principles here. It's governance. So did you determine what you were going to do with it? Audit. Can you see what's happening with it? And then action. Do you have ability to respond? So when you determine what you want, how do you see what you have? And how do you get it back to what you want in the quickest possible way to get the most efficient out of it? And Donald, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's kind of the approach that we took with the Cloud Cost Optimization Advisory Services. We're trying to figure out, what gives you the most value, what are the things that matter, how can we fulfill what the different business units and technical groups need that then feed back to the business.
And Shadoe, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. By and large, we are looking ultimately at efficiency. We know there's going to be spend. We know that we need workloads and clock cycles and storage and network and all these things to make the business do, or to help the business do what it needs to do. But we want to be as efficient as possible and not overspending or wasting those dollars that we're investing into these workloads.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Right? I think that that's where it's really at. It's a value. This is a value play. It's an investment. There should be an ROI to your cloud projects. It's not just something IT does. It's something that benefits the business and pushes it forward. So really, these 6 things we think are the ones that people are tending to struggle with more than others. And what do you think they are in priority, Donald?
Well, I kind of think, the granularity of the cloud bills is what, when we've talked to people, has thrown them for loops because, they have 30 different buckets and they can't quite figure out. So that's like number 1, and that gets kind of made worse by the fact it's easy to provision all these services. And then, the constant change comes next, and the other 3 could be in whatever order. Those are kind of the ones the way I think about it.
Yeah, I would certainly agree because things change and they change rapidly. And it's so easy to, create a POC. You just basically click, point, and done. And then you've got consumption into a POC. So knowing what you want a POC and being able to see it and being able to control costs on things that are brand new is really tough because they may ramp up rather rapidly. You set something, you think it's very small. Day 1, the consumption is free because you haven't hit that tier yet where your consumption is. And then, day 2, did you remember to set the billing alerts? Did you remember to figure out what the pricing is? Like how granular do we want to get? Then it's more of how are we doing it, right? There's a million ways to accomplish it. The excess of alternative architectures. And then lack of standardization. What happens on Amazon and Google, on Azure, on OCI, IBM, any of the other clouds, they're different. It may be a similar service, but it's definitely going to work a little bit differently. And what do you think about this slide, Shadoe?
I think you made a really good point, particularly with the granularity of the bills and the rapid pace of change. And even we see that in just the raw billing as well. It can be, in addition to all of your other duties when you are running an IT department, extremely arduous to understand what's going on with the billing and how to interpret it, how to charge back, show back, etc. What needs to go where within the business. And it's a monster, a nightmare project almost.
Yeah, I think if you have a strong FinOps practice, you can get really good guidance internally, but without that, it's going to be hard to start placing these things immediately under governance.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's really lacking in a lot of places still. So,
yeah, and I know a lot of people really kind of despise the idea of governance. They hate the process. I find that it really provides a good foundation to make things work optimally. As much as it's a struggle, especially on the developer front, getting developers to do that, it's a huge challenge. But I think it's worth the run.
Also, if they haven't figured out sort of what their landing zone concept is and how do they want to deal with their workloads, it gets complicated because there's no structure behind it, and they haven't structured it. Then billing becomes secondary because they're just trying to figure out how to deploy it all.
Yeah, without even a second thought. I rarely hear developers talk about, how much does it cost? They want to know, did it work? Is it deployable? Is this thing going to solve a problem? Cost falls a little bit down. So we're going to talk a little bit about optimization of cost. So in this slide, there's 3 pieces of low-hanging fruit that we like to approach. And these 3 things overlap each other. The Venn diagram we'll show at the end, but it's pretty tightly coupled. And it's over-provisioning and inefficiency. In the past, we used to have to really know what we wanted before we racked a server. It was coming. We were going to, load it up, put it in the rack, and then we'd have to work around what its efficiency was. Now we just change sizes. We scale differently. We vertically or horizontally move it. But have we done that to true efficiency? In most cases, probably not. Number 2 is automation gaps and potential. There's an infinite number of tools for automation, CI, CD, CM, so many different ways to get you to where you want to be. But do you know where you want to be? Do you know how to make the cloud work for you in an efficient model? And then last, your total spend. So on any of the major cloud service providers, or hypervisors, as some people are calling them nowadays, you can get your total spend reduced by committing. On some of the clouds, it's how much use are you doing. On some of it, it's really more of a formal commit. But when you get to a formal commit, then it changes things a little bit because now you're locked in. And you went from total OpEx, consumption-based model, to I feel that's more of a CapEx because you're committing to that over periods of time. So what do you think, Donald?
Yeah, I mean, that's the goal that people are trying to get to. But part of the problem is that when they have a new application come in, or we have to move this workload, then all of a sudden they're like, oh, do we have the right set of optimizations to make that work? And then they're kind of trying to figure it out, and how do we rebuild that back to a business unit? And do we have figured out how the business units help pay for the whole thing?
Yeah, that is a huge challenge with, everything's moving, everything's different. I think it still comes back to governance. The better the governance, the better the footprint, the better the declaration of what you want, the more likely you are to get it. So let's think, but how? So we're all architects at the core. So I like 5 pillars, 6-pillar sustainability. We'll leave that out for this conversation. How do we optimize? We do it for costs. Security, without question, is obviously critical. But we also want to optimize for performance, for operational excellence and reliability. So it's not about just cost. Because if it doesn't work right, if it's slow, if it's not reliable, no one's going to care what it costs. You're going to get nothing but complaints. So it's about balancing those in a value, equation. What do you think, Shadoe? How do you normally use this?
Yeah, I think this is something you have to, of course, cost and security tend to be the first things that everybody thinks about. But I can reduce the cost to almost zero and make something completely secure by shutting it off, essentially, right? But that doesn't give us any performance. It doesn't give us any ability to interact or clients the ability to interact. So we have to think about what the actual business needs are and how far we can reasonably push the cost down, reasonably control our security while still allowing the application or workload to do what it needs to do, while still making things reliable, scaling when they need to, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just cost. There are so many other things that affect that, and there are times when it's appropriate to spend more to have a more performant or more reliable system.
Oh, absolutely. I would think, yeah. I mean, depends upon the business goal. Everything has to come down to what the business gets out of it. Business is the bullseye, IT after that, and then kind of let things flow. But if we're not driving the business forward, I mean, is it really truly a value-based equation? I think that.
And a lot of that can be found in good governance, building that foundation, knowing what not only you want from your cloud service provider, hypervisor, et cetera, but also what you want from those given workloads. Is this something that's purely experimental and we're just monkeying with it on every third Friday, or is this a critical business application that makes the firm do what it does?
Yeah, and those matter a lot when how you put these pillars in a priority. Where are you setting things up? I mean, they all need to balance and they all need to be as optimized as possible. But yeah, within reason to what your goal is. Setting a goal, having some governance, determining, what your step off is. I think it matters a lot in that. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about over provisioning of compute. And this is a generalized slide that gives you kind of an idea on what you can optimize for provisioning. And on Amazon, it would be things like EC2, Fargate Lambda, SageMaker Analytics. On Azure, it's database, compute, storage, analytics, and roughly the same thing on Google. Compute, Anthos, BigQuery, database, which is all basically database, compute, storage, analytics across the three major cloud providers. In most cases, over-provisioned resources can be reduced by 40 to 60%. We can get you to really narrow focus and really high performance and save about 40 to 60% in many cases. Not always, and not on really giant farms. It kind of depends. And it depends on how consistent it is. So I think, that's going to be one of the big things. And then you could use spot instances. So however we want to call spot, or, dismissables, non-reserved, just temporary.
Ephemeral. There's a lot of words.
Yeah, you could save 90% if you're willing to take the risk. And maybe you are. Maybe certain things require a lot of compute for a very short window of time. Great. That would be even better. But you're going to need automation to make that work. And that's some of the overlap we talked about. Any comments on the slide, Donald?
Yeah, I mean, this is the hard part. It kind of depends on the architecture. If you've got legacy applications, a lot harder to do. If you started moving to containers and microservices and Kubernetes, it's a little simpler because you can figure out how you can vertically and horizontally scale those things a lot easier. And those affect that. It kind of depends what it looks like. If it's a huge SAP farm, then that's super complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends what's on it to be sure about that. So let's look at number 2, inefficiency of autoscale and automation. We think about 60% of scalable resources. I mean, clients think 30%. We think about 60% of your scalable resources, which is not everything in the cloud, but there's a lot of things that have scalability, aren't optimized. And there's things like autoscale, which would be horizontal, so lateral more, creating more instances, starting with a small one and then being willing to step out. vertical, larger, and we have a slide that's going to talk a little bit more about a theoretical idea on how this works. And then other things, elasticity. So idle instances, regional demand, DR, HA, like how are these fitting into the model? How are you managing your risk? How are you hitting your goals? And also being cost optimized. It's possible that you may not need a second region, or you might need less in a second region, rather than just putting active clusters up just to make sure you get RPO and RTO. We could look more about how do we scale them? What is the best possible way? And then something referred to just as automation. So if your business is a 9 to 5 and you're really not, you don't have customers overnight, or you don't have things that are going on, we could shut things off. Shutting off your bastions lowers your security risk footprint, plus it lowers your bill if you've got things like that set up in the cloud. You may want to move to serverless, but even if you don't, if you're not using it, can you turn it off? Or can you get it down to a really small level of consumption? What's your scale up need? DR and HA, like I talked about. And die design, so distributed, immutable, ephemeral. If you've got these instances spread out, you can spin them up whenever you want, spin them down whenever you want. That architecture design pattern can really save you a lot of money, because now you've got cattle, not pets, and that's big in the automation market. And Shadoe, what do you think about this?
Yeah, that was just the point that I was going to make too. Recognizing that when we had data centers and we had to buy an individual server to do an individual thing, they really were pets. They were our cats and dogs and required a tremendous amount of care and feeding, and you really had to know what you were going to do with that. But using this die model where everything's distributed, immutable, ephemeral, it basically doesn't matter. You throw it, you turn it off, you throw it away when you don't need it, rebuild a new one as soon as you have that need again for whatever that workload is. With a 9 to 5 type business where they're primarily just a narrow window, it becomes a lot easier to build out that automation and understand what those needs are. If you have a business that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year, particularly things like retail, where you have big spikes at the end of the year, different other industries, you could still take advantage of this, but you may not see as much savings because they tend to be a little more active. So yeah, it depends on the business needs and understanding what your users and what your clients both need and how to best fulfill that part of the mission.
But even with retail, you can kind of look at, as long as you receive the order and then you can place it, you can actually not have to have everything up all the time, because you really kind of think about it. Getting that order placed and receiving it does not mean you immediately trigger the process to ship it. So you can then reduce some of your spend at that level too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You don't need the entire workflow or the entire chain available all the time. You just need to capture the important data points and then process them in a batch, say when everybody comes in the morning and can deal with it.
Right, and that could be your spot instances. Queue everything up overnight, asynchronously process in the morning with your spot instances, and that goes away. Could be a pretty significant savings. A 9 to 5 that cuts their budget can, it's 66% of your time is time you're not actively using it. And, everybody I think could benefit. So the next slide talks a little bit about that. And this is kind of an interesting where we talk about what you currently have, what you might want to do, and then what you could end up with. And, you probably have autoscale. So that probably exists. I mean, most people that have a cloud set up some autoscale groups, and they set up some targets, and they've got golden images and things spin. They're working on some distributed, ephemeral, immutable. There's probably some manual operations. Certain times of the year, you want to scale up more, maybe times of the week, things you want to do. There's probably someone that goes in, clicks a button, makes something happen. That's common across a lot of businesses. And then there's the black box. These exist, people use them. They look for optimizations, and they're saying, all right, I bought this tool. It tells me what my optimization pattern is. I plugged it in and it did it. It scaled my servers exactly where I wanted them to go. Great, we're done. The black box is critical, though, because what do you know about the black box? What if the black box goes dark? What if that company stops providing the service? What if that company gets breached? What if something happens to your black box? Can you replicate that? Or do you immediately start incurring costs or, incurring performance hits because it didn't do what you thought it was going to do at some point in time? How much are you dependent upon the third party, the black box, to handle things? Is it just to validate what you thought, or is it critical to what it's doing? You're letting it hit your APIs and actually scale your resources based on what it knows. And normally, most of these boxes have to learn. So if it's something new for your business, you want to try something new, you're going to have a period of learning before you get to optimizations. And Shadoe and Donald, how do you guys feel about the current as is? Do you find most of your customers fit into that model somewhere?
Yeah, I think that's pretty common right now. It's something that we see a lot.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't. I mean, if they've started their cloud journey, it's a different thought process, especially if they're moving from on-premise. They want to get the things spun up. There's one client who I had a meeting with this morning where that's their whole problem. They're trying to move into a hyperscaler, and they're really thinking about it. How did it work on-premise? So they haven't really addressed these because they, I can send somebody down to the data center if something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's a new world. So I think the transition is looking at business processes. You know your business, absolutely, and you know what you want to have happen. So whether it's a 9 to 5, whether it's 24/7, whether it's weekend centric, whether you want to run a sale. There's a sale coming, and you're going to have some massive driver, the Super Bowl. You need to scale vertically and horizontally to handle a Super Bowl ad that's going to drive millions upon millions of traffic hits. Well, that comes down to your 5 pillars: cost, security, performance, operational excellence, reliability, in conjunction with business processes. So not IT processes anymore. It's what does the business want out of it? And then we're going to achieve it through, in this case, we have Terraform, but it could be the native cloud provider, CloudFormation or cloud deployment. You have a bunch of different options. It could be CI/CD, CM, however we want to get there. But it's this distributed, immutable, ephemeral model that makes this really work. And here I talked a little about 2B. So you could come out and the box might tell you M5 2XL, 24 hours a day. It's good. That'll get you to a pretty optimized provision. You don't have to do much. That's the right size. It keeps everything from going out of, outside of the bounds. Never gets idle, never goes over 100%. And maybe you put in some steps to that. You have auto scale. But what if your business was, more of a 9 to 5, and you said, all right, for the first 4 hours of the day, everyone comes in, hits this application, and drives traffic. We could put up an M5 8XL. You get 4x performance for the first 4 hours. People come in, they get everything, it's working well, there's no delays. We step it down in the second half of the day. So really post-lunch, we start to scale this into what would be in the 24-hour window. We know M5 2XL is going to handle it. It would have handled it before. But we've given a little bit more. And then the last 2 hours of the day, we're watching things scale down. We put it down to XL. And then after that, we roll it down to a large, and we go for the rest of the 24 hours. Well, it's $9.12 versus $9.22. We're giving you much more performance on the front end for the same money in a 24-hour period. And you can couple this with horizontals. You could say at night, sometimes I get spikes. Great. We could scale out 2, 3, 4 at a time. You don't have to scale one at a time. You decide what your business needs. What does a spike look like? How does that get handled? All of these things come in, and then this flows down into our model where we talk about over-provision compute, automation efficiency, capacity commitment, and how we get to what could be up to 20% savings. Not for gigantic spends, because you start to use services that are very hard to optimize, and other things come into play for that. But on initial transfers, smaller accounts, as you're scaling, if you do this, you can get really good control over it, and that's a reasonable number to reach. Shadoe, Donald, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of what we really were trying to hit with the cloud advisory service. If we get to that 20%, then everything kind of works the way it should, and everyone would walk away happy, especially the business.
Yeah, ultimately, baking this flexibility and this mindset in when you're hopefully when you're earlier in the journey, as opposed to having millions of workloads in the cloud, and trying to retrofit things is going to provide a much better savings and a much better just way of looking at how you work in the cloud.
Absolutely. And last but not least is the spending commitment part. And this is where I think it goes, to me, it goes from OPEX to CAPEX. Other people may feel a little differently because you're still paying monthly. There's still some flexibility. But I think once you make a commitment, you've committed capital in a little bit different way. So I think that's kind of where you're going to have to figure out, at AWS, they call it the private term pricing sheet, Azure prepayment, Google commitment agreement. They're all roughly the same thing. You tell them what you're willing to commit to, and they give you a discount based on your commitment. And I think most people have these. As soon as you get going and you've got some consumption and your bills start to rise, this becomes a thing. But if your spending commitments didn't include optimization of compute and optimization of automation, have you committed for too much? Have you committed something that you're maybe not going to spend? And how do you find customers are handling that now, Shadoe?
Well, like we've been talking about, the optimization for not only sizing, vertical, horizontal scaling, and also automation is something that people are just really getting a good handle on, or getting a good idea about, and starting to develop ways to do this. So oftentimes they have committed to things that may be oversized for that current workload, but with additional opportunities, they find ways to use those commitments. And sometimes it's a scramble to find ways to use those commitments, because they haven't, when they start optimizing their automation and scaling, they find that they've overcommitted. So now we've got all this stuff. What do we do with it? Well, let's go find something else to do. So yeah, it's what's the cliche? Chicken or the egg? Which one do you do first? Which comes first? Yeah, it's still a very real struggle for a lot of firms, and I found a lot of people need an objective view into these things to help them better understand, without any connection to the business processes that develop these things, right? So a little more of an outside viewpoint can be helpful in analyzing some of these things and being a little dispassionate, for pet projects that people develop.
Excellent. And did you have anything down?
Yeah, I mean, it's them also creating a culture of DevOps and automation. If you haven't really gone about that as part of your culture and integrated that from the different business teams to the IT resources, it's complicated, because those cultural things are a lot more complicated than what we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and this kind of is the big picture, as is to be. So you start with over-provisioned compute, lack of automation, lack of a spending plan, and then you're going to use some tooling in the middle to get you to that. For transition of over-provision, you're going to use possibly the native tools. All the cloud providers have them. There's third-party solutions that tell you what your provisioning is, and we're going to use them too, because insight is not a bad thing. It's over-dependence upon them that can cause problems. So, we love automation, we love tooling, we love insight. We love a way that gives us high confidence. But we always put the business processes in here, because in the end, that's all that matters. Unless you're strictly IT, but even if you are an IT business, you still have goals. And we want to get you to right sizing. But all that still falls under the 5 pillars of operational excellence, security, performance, reliability, cost. Every one of these things is always going to hit that same structure. And we should be able to justify everything we've done against our 5 pillars. And our lack of automation, we're going to solve that maybe with, reserved instances, reserved compute. That might be the better plan for you. Rather than pulling an instance, you pull an amount of compute and work a spend on different families. You've got Spot, you've got Cloud Deploy, Terraform, Jenkins, Ansible. You've got S3, cloud store, blob. Are we setting up data life cycles? Are we optimizing for that? Are we putting everything on hot storage? Are we putting things into Glacier events? Could save a lot of money by moving your data from active storage to Glacier, storage. And automation will do that. Life cycles will handle your data for you inside of the policies. Because if you put data in Glacier and you need it, it can get really pricey if you want to pull that out real quick, depending on the size of the data. Quick thaws are certainly something to be avoided if possible. And last but not least, we're going to talk about spending plans. So private pricing, prepayment, commitment. If you've gone there, it's going to reallocate funds for other projects. The sooner your spend is out of alignment with your commit, the sooner you can get back online. If we do it in the last year, because it's usually a 3 to 5 year commit, if you do it in your last year, it's going to be a much larger struggle. And so what do you guys think of all these possible solutions and pathways? What do you think is the thing clients struggle with the most?
They use the native tools and they pull up some numbers, and then they're trying to understand what do these mean, because there's not a labeling strategy. It's just a report with a bunch of, bar graphs, and they're looking at trying to figure how does this map to the stuff we've provisioned, and how does this map to the projects we're using.
Yeah, the data provided by most of the different service providers is very arcane and requires a very esoteric knowledge. You almost feel like a necromancer or something sometimes looking at this stuff. It's hard to wade through, and it's hard to understand where you need to go first, what the easy things are, what the sort of medium things are, and then what the challenging things are that may provide a much bigger benefit, but are much harder to do. And prioritizing those things becomes a massive challenge for anyone who's doing this the first time. You almost don't know where to start.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. And the sooner you get on it, the less of a challenge it is. And you get into these $50, $100 million spends and then try to optimize. It is, it's daunting. For sure.
It's a big project, and it takes a long time when you've let it go that far. It's much better, like Donald mentioned earlier, having that culture where you're doing this from day one. Again, going back to the good governance thing that we always harp on all the time. If you've got that groundwork, if you've got that foundation, it's a lot easier to grow and to face these challenges. But if you don't have that and you're realizing that you need it, years into your journey, even months potentially, it could be a big thing to overcome.
Yeah. And then I think sometimes the challenge alone makes it a deterrent, because you're less likely to want to take it on when you realize how much work it's going to be and how long it's going to take you to realize the savings, the performance, the returns, be able to show that ROI up the food chain. So the last slide is how we talk to the cloud savings relationship. So when we talk about it in general terms, we're saying over provision compute, 40-60% on the compute stack. But that might get you 6% of your total spend, especially if it's early on in your process. Automation efficiency might save you 15% on things you can automate, but that's another 6% of your total spend. When you think about what is that really affecting? And then your capacity commitment. If you commit, they might give you 30%, 35%, 20, somewhere in that general area, depending upon how much your consumption is and what you're consuming and how long you're willing to commit for. But if you add those together on your total spend for things you can commit to, optimize, and automate, you can save up to 20%. So we don't feel it's a huge leap to get there. We feel that number is really achievable, and we've seen some results for that. So that's how we got to that number. And we're going to take some questions. So where do you want to start? Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, we have a question here. As companies transition from on-prem to cloud, should they be prepared for a period of time, months, quarters, where the spend is more than being purely on-prem? If so, in your experience, how long and how much more?
I certainly have an opinion. Donald, Shadoe, you want to take it?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a high possibility. Again, we talked a little bit about culture, going back to governance. Um, if you have the sort of right governance and guardrails set up before you start, then you're only you're only spending what you need to, and you're being smart, you're being efficient about that. You may realize savings up front, but it's an uncommon thing to happen.
Yeah. What do you think, Donald?
Yeah, I think I agree with Shadow. It is uncommon because if you've planned, you start going to the cloud and you're trying to figure out how much do I move, where does it go. It is complicated to figure out where that goes because then you also have to create that governance structure that says on this date we're going to be 80% here and 20% there, and that isn't so simple to come up with.
Yeah, I've seen it go as high as double. As people make the move to the cloud. The cloud isn't always cheaper. It might not even be cheaper because of how much consumption you do, how you plan for it, what you put up there. It's not a given that you can move from on-prem to the cloud and save money. I think it's optimal, sure, but at first I think it's a huge challenge to get people there. And I've seen people, take years. And it depends. Are you going to lift and shift? Are you just going to rehost it? Are you going to re-platform it? Are you going to re-architect it? Like, which one of the strategies are you going to take to the cloud? Knowing what that is going to give you a lot of, structure to how that's going to go. But I definitely see it being one of those things. If you're honest about what the real structure is going to be and how you're going to do it, are you going to just move it and then shut everything off? That's the best way to control for it. And then if you've got good controls and optimization, I think that can work. So hopefully that answered your question. So yeah, if you want to grab the question, looks like Mateo had a good question in the chat.
Yeah, we have another one here. One of the challenges we see is that some customers do not put enough time in governance and resource management planning, especially when you combine production, dev, and test environments and allow some autonomy in management of those environments by various groups.
I mean, I don't know that I would even say some. I would say most, a lot. It's a struggle. And like I said, governance is almost a dirty word to a lot of people. It seems like you're getting put in a cage. It's so hard. You don't want to participate in those sessions. They're long, they're dry. You've got to come up with controls, internal audit, all the things that go with it. It's like, I just want to go fast and build things. But if you don't put those in, yeah, you're going to struggle. So production, dev, test in sandbox, right? If you want to start putting things in a sandbox, how do you do that? Starts with governance, starts with guardrails, starts with how you build your org, set up your OUs. And what are you guys seeing, Shadoe, Donald?
Yeah, those foundational pieces are, yeah, sure, they're boring. Who wants to sit and argue over, is this the right one or is this the right one for hours and hours and hours with 20 people? I don't think any of us really enjoy doing that very much. Not too many of us are policy guys by nature. But either through good experiences or bad, we come to understand how important those things are and how necessary the foundation is to what we intend to build and what we intend to grow in the future. And without those, we're really doing a disservice to not only the business unit that we are attached to, but also the firm at large.
Yeah, and you also have to think about how do you help, integrate those DevOps practices in the different groups, especially if you've got your development group, building their sandbox, and how do they, pull those in? It's sort of like the Phoenix project. You got to make sure you have all those concepts built in so they know how those play out across the board.
That's a big deal. And it's actually funny that you mentioned the Phoenix project because like when I had engineering teams, I would make them read that. So as part of my DevOps thing, I'd give everyone the Phoenix project and I would say, read it. And let's be sure we're on the same page as we're developing this. Now, also maybe the Unicorn project, because we're talking about DevOps, we probably pushed through a couple of things. I find that helps, right? That's also like governance. It's also alignment, but even when we started sprints, it would be more coming back to what's the business goal of the sprint. And that's the same thing with governance. If we can, put these things in line and say, my engineer knows why we're building this thing in this way, we're so much more likely to get the value that we want. And it's a huge challenge. And it has to be top-down buy-in. Without that, it's just going to be a really painful struggle. And, but it's not one that's, unachievable. Even if you've gone down that path, even if you're not happy, like there are solutions that can make this work. So let's see the next question. We have some great questions here.
Next question. Yeah. What is your point of view on optimization across multi-cloud by moving from one cloud to another? Do you see that happening?
Donald, you want to start off?
I mean, multi-cloud that's a complicated thing. You have to have the right cloud foundations in place to be able to handle that and determine what your workloads look like. And, are you going to move to containers? Where does Kubernetes fit in that? That gets very complicated because you're starting to say, they're not exactly a one-to-one mapping because you have to figure out, well, GCP does it this way, Azure does it this way. And that's why you see there's a lot of discussion online where people are saying, well, maybe Kubernetes becomes the platform for what we're doing. So it isn't that simple because you have to figure out how do you unify those in whatever framework you're going to do.
Absolutely. And I would say I am seeing this. So I see clients that get some way down the road with one of the cloud service providers, and for whatever reason, maybe it's skill sets, maybe it's desired outcome. Sometimes there's better deals involved in what they're trying to consume, and they'll move. It's a huge endeavor to take that on. So if you're going to jump cross cloud, unless you're going to integrate with something else, I like Anthos. It's kind of the standalone on that in many cases, but it gives you some opportunities, to pair it across. There's things like Azure Service Mesh that you could use to orchestrate across clouds. We have solutions, and here at Taos, we're pretty agnostic. So, we really will work with you where you are in your journey. It doesn't matter what you've chosen or how you choose to go forward. We have a lot of depth. And that's a big part of, why we choose what we choose, why we choose the agnostic tools like Terraform, or any of those other things. We like the ones that people could just use wherever they are. And looks like we have another question.
Yeah. What changes need to be made to DevOps and SRE parts of the org as part of a cloud migration journey?
What do you think, Shadoe? You want to start with this one?
Yeah, but you would really have to know to answer this properly. You would really have to know where that and what the sort of policies, procedures, governance built into what's going on on-prem now, and how you're going to modify that to make it work in the cloud as you migrate your workloads. It depends on, it just depends on so much. I think it's going to be different for every firm. It's going to be different for even different business units within the firm and how they address whatever it is that they're developing, whatever they're operating, right? There's no good canned answer for this one, but I can say based on my experience that, there are changes. Sometimes it's additional education and you're learning new tools and getting new opportunities there. Other times it's a complete change to your governance and policies and foundational pieces because you have a much different set of tools and opportunities in the cloud than you would have in a data center where you just racked and stacked 1,000 Dell servers. There are changes that are probably going to be necessary or absolutely going to be necessary. What those changes are, I don't have a canned answer because I would have to dive into what the business is doing now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was going to say the same thing though. Training, it works.
Important.
And scaling up on the tool sets because it still comes down to governance, auditability, and action. If you can get those three things in line, especially with your SRE, can your SREs see it, identify it, and optimize it? Because that's essentially what they're doing. on a daily basis on the ops side. And how is DevOps going to hand over in the cloud? Are you fully optimized? Are you going to add in chaos engineering when you bring that to the cloud? Do you already have that? If you already have a big Simian army or Gremlin or something else that you're using to test these resources, or is that something you're going to add? And I think that, all of those things combined need to get put into. And don't let me cut you off, Donald. Imagine you have something to say.
Well, it's just also thinking about the whole, test pyramid concept that underlies all the chaos engineering. Where do your end-to-end tests go? Where do your unit tests go? How do all those get played out? How do you test your infrastructure? How do you test your infrastructure on top of your applications? And if they're containers, how do you know those things are deployed right? There's a whole host of just questions. There's like hundreds that just come to my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we definitely, as I can, not to really beat the horse, but we meet you on the journey. So where are you? What are you doing? What are your concerns? Everybody's a little different, like Shadoe said. We can't just tell you like, oh, if you do A, B, and C, this is the recipe to make your DevOps and SRE work optimally. Because the span of skill sets and workflows are so vast, from manual, with 3 days of change control to full CI/CD working off of SDLC. Like there's, with 25 deployments a day, there's really, everybody's in a little different place. So I think that's it. Other questions?
We have one more, but before I do that, I just want to remind everybody too that there's a link on your screen right there. That's a free consultation. If you just type that in, get that information in, you'll be able to get a free consultation with one of our guys. Next question. What are your strategies to optimize costs in the cloud today?
So I'll let you start with that, Donald, since you guys created the underlying process. Tell us how we're going to do it.
A lot of them, how do you go that? Looking at, do you have your reserved instances? Do you have your spots instances? Do you know your capacity of the various things you're moving? How much storage do you need? Does it need to be cold or hot storage? How often do you do backups? All of those things that fundamentally you'd actually want to do even in a data center. It's still the same questions. You're just moving it to a more fluid environment where you can do those, but it's no different than the way you did it in the past. You just have to think about it because it's easier to push a button than you could do it in the past.
Yeah. And Shadoe?
Yeah, a lot of those foundational things are never going to change, no matter what sort of environment we are working out of, whether it's data center in our own building, a data center across town, or we're renting a cage or somewhere in the cloud. A lot of it comes down to the ability to perform the analysis and the ability to act on that analysis, right? We've got hopefully good governance, but we still have to audit and analyze, and we have to be able to act on that analysis. We have to be able to go somewhere with that, know who to talk to, how to get things changed, whether it's change control board or whoever might be leading a given program. We need to resize this. We need to do X, Y, Z. This, storage footprint should be moved from hot to cold, et cetera, building policies to do all that stuff. So yeah, it comes down to good analysis and action based on that analysis.
Yeah, I think, and that depends how you want to do it. I might like to start with a WAR or a well-architected review. Where are you currently? If you've done a WAR, great, even better. If you haven't, maybe we should do one and figure it out. And then there's really two strategies from there. You can say we can optimize now, then move, or we could optimize as part of the move, and then change management becomes a little easier. People tend to hate change. So I think it's a lot of times that people want to move and make all the changes and sort of blame it on the move. But I find that a fixed point, and I keep coming back to that 5 pillars, but I really find it gives us a functional point to, agree on. Like, where are we going? What are we doing? How are we pointing this? And then we can say, okay, it meets these criteria each and every time. So that way we're not really, shifting goalposts. We have a really fixed goalpost, and then it gives us that governance that we want.
Yeah, I was going to say, would that be, again, a foundational piece, that governance that's important? Yeah. I don't know how many times we've said the word governance, but probably not enough.
Yeah, I could say a lot. One of my other ones I like is the idea of this thing called the 12-factor app that came out 12, 14 years ago with Roku. If you look at what a 12-factor app is, it's really the basis of cloud native. So the ability to look at some of those principles, configuration, all the things we're talking about really helps you think about what you're doing.
I agree.
Absolutely. So I think that we have arrived at the end. I don't see any more questions.
No more questions. No. That's it. So we thank you all for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. And we're glad to answer any questions you have, any follow-up. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, reach out anytime.
Thank you all.
Thank you.